Snow fell that morning as if heaven had turned to ash. The world was white and soundless, save for the distant moan of the wind scraping across the barren hills. On that pale horizon, a figure moved, small, stubborn, and half swallowed by the storm. Mara Calden's boots broke through the crusted snow, her shawl stiff with frost, her arms tightening around the boy she carried. Jonas's head rested against her collarbone, limp with hunger. For 3 days, they had walked with nothing but melted snow for drink and prayer for strength. Now, her vision blurred at the edges, and she wondered if perhaps she'd already crossed into heaven or hell. But when the faint glow of a lantern flickered against the white, she forced her legs to move again. She reached the porch of a lonely ranch house, its timbers groaning beneath the storm's weight. She raised a trembling hand and knocked once. The sound was barely a whisper lost to the wind. Inside, boots scraped the floorboards, then silence again. She tried to knock twice more, weaker this time, before the door creaked open. A man stood there, tall, framed by the glow of firelight. Snow melted down his coat, gathering in the grooves of his weathered face. His eyes were the color of storm clouds before rain, steady, unreadable. He looked at the woman swaying before him, the child in her arms. "We haven't eaten in 5 days," she whispered, voice barely alive. The man didn't speak at first. He only looked at her, then stepped aside. "Then you best come in, ma'am." Warmth hit her like a wave. Her knees gave out, and she would have fallen if he hadn't caught her under the arms. The boys stirred faintly as the man carried them inside, setting them near the hearth. He moved without hurry, stoking the fire, wrapping a rough wool blanket around the child, then pouring water from a kettle that hissed over the flames. Mara tried to rise, to thank him, but her pride and exhaustion wrestled in silence. "We can't stay long," she murmured. "You'll stay till you can walk steady," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Name's Elias Thorne," she nodded faintly. "Mara Calden, this is my boy Jonas." He nodded once, as if storing the names away like seed in winter. Then he cut a loaf of bread, hard, 2 days old maybe, and set it before them. Mara hesitated, her fingers hovering. She hated the shame of taking what wasn't hers. But Jonas reached for the crust, his lips parting in a faint sigh as he chewed. Elias looked away to give her privacy, to let her pride breathe. The fire popped softly between them. As the storm clawed at the shutters, Mara dozed in the chair. Her dreams were sharp with memory. Her husband's coughing in the mine, the preacher's pitying eyes when she'd begged for work, the faces in town turning away. She woke to find Elias sitting nearby, repairing a torn leather strap by lamplight. His movements were patient, deliberate, as though the act itself steadied his mind. "You live alone?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Since the fever last winter. Took my kin and my dog both. Haven't much use for company since." Mara stared into the fire. "Grief's a strange kind of hunger. It eats what's left of you." Elias's hands paused, just for a breath. "You speak truth there." The room settled into a rhythm, the soft click of the needle, the faint whistle of the wind, the sound of Jonas's small breaths. When she thanked him again, he said nothing. Only nodded once, as if to say that some kindnesses didn't need words. Days passed like that, stitched together by silence and necessity. Elias rode out at dawn to tend his herd, leaving extra wood by the fire and a note scratched onto old feed paper. "There's soup in the pot. Eat while it's warm." Mara began sweeping the floors, washing what little there was to wash. It felt strange, this domestic peace, stranger still to feel safe. When she ventured into town one afternoon for flour, the quiet stares began. 2 women whispered outside the mercantile. One smiled thinly, too polite to be kind. The other didn't bother hiding her smirk. "Poor Elias," she said just loud enough. "Can't stand the cold, so he brings home a widow to warm the bed." Mara's hands trembled as she paid for the flour. She said nothing, but she carried the weight of their words all the way back to the ranch. The wind cut her face like glass, but shame stung deeper. That evening, Elias noticed her silence. "Town treating you right?" he asked while ladling soup into bowls. "They talk," she said, her voice low. "They always do." He stirred the pot once more, slow and steady. "Let 'em! Talk keeps 'em warm, I reckon." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Jonas began helping Elias in small ways, fetching pails of water, brushing the horses. The boys' laughter came back in pieces, fragile at first, then sure. Mara watched from the porch as Elias lifted him onto the back of a mare, one hand firm at the child's waist. There was gentleness in his roughness, a care that came from habit, not show. That night, as they ate by lamplight, Elias said, "You ever think of leaving these parts when spring comes?" Mara looked down. "Where would I go? Folks don't hire widows with children, and I've buried enough ground to call it home." Elias didn't reply, but he set another log on the fire, and for the first time, the flame's warmth reached the corners of the room. When the next snow came, heavy and wet, Mara found him mending the fence line despite the cold biting through his gloves. She walked out with a cup of coffee, steam curling between them. "You'll lose your fingers to frost before you're done," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "A rare thing. Fingers ain't much use if the cattle wander off." "Still," she said, handing him the cup, "you could let the morning go." He accepted it without a word. Their fingers brushed, the barest touch, a flicker of warmth against the wind. She turned away first, not out of modesty, but because something inside her hurt in a new way, like a frozen river shifting under the first thaw. That evening, when Elias read a verse aloud from his Bible and stumbled over a word, Mara finished it for him without thinking. "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth softening. "Maybe," she murmured. "God's not done with us yet." Outside, the wind quieted. The snow fell in slow, forgiving flakes. Jonas slept on a pallet near the fire, his small hand clutching the hem of his mother's skirt. Elias sat across from her, his shadow dancing against the wall. For the first time in months, Mara's heartbeat slowed. The ache in her chest, that constant hollow throb, eased. She realized she no longer felt like a visitor in this house of wood and silence. Something unseen had begun to grow between the walls. Something fragile, yes, but alive. Later, when the fire burned low, Elias rose and checked the door latch. He paused, looking back at her for a long moment. "You'll be safe here," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. He nodded once and disappeared into the back room, his footsteps soft against the worn planks. Mara stared into the dying embers, their glow reflected in her tired eyes. Outside, the storm had passed. The land was silent, heavy with snow, but no longer cruel. Old Finch's voice returns in the mind's echo of memory, as if he's sitting by a winter window, telling the tale to whoever will listen. There are nights when a soul starves not for bread, but for a place to rest its hunger. And sometimes grace doesn't come in sermons or sunlight. Sometimes it knocks at your door half frozen and asks only for warmth. By morning the house was still, the air sweet with the scent of ash and coffee. Elias stepped outside to break ice from the troughs, and Mara watched him from the doorway, her shawl drawn tight. Jonas laughed somewhere behind her, his voice bright against the pale sky. And though the road ahead was long, and tongues in town would never tire, something within her knew. Winter had lost its hold. The thaw crept slow, reluctant as the town's whispering tongues. Ash Hollow had a way of watching, waiting, and when it saw Elias Thorne bring Mara Calden inside, it didn't see charity. It saw scandal. At the saloon, whispers curled around the stove like smoke. "He's feeding her. They say he's sharing his bed, too." Clara Wynn's eyes flicked away, uneasy with the gossip she dared not voice aloud. Sheriff Cole Dunbar, a man more of silence than speech, warned Elias quietly as they stood beneath the bare branches outside the church. "Folks talk for a reason, Thorne. You give them cause, they won't stop." Elias met the sheriff's gaze with steady calm. They weren't there when she knocked. But the weight of those words settled heavier than any winter snow. Mara felt it most sharply when she ventured into town alone, clutching a sack of flour in one hand and Jonas's small mitten in the other. At the general store, two women leaned close, their voices a low drip of poison. A widow and a rancher? What's she really after? The smirk in one woman's eyes burned deeper than frostbite. Mara's cheeks burned hotter, shame wrapping her like a second skin. She dropped the flour, the sack tearing open, white powder spilling into the dirt. No one moved to help. That evening, silence hung between her and Elias like the thick smoke of a snuffed candle. At the table, he ladled soup into their bowls with a quiet purpose. "Town treating you right?" he asked, voice low and careful. "They talk," Mara said, her voice brittle. "And I hate every word," Elias nodded, stirring the pot slowly. "Let 'em! Talk's the only warmth they've got." She wanted to believe him. To believe that somewhere beyond the gossip and the cold stares, she was more than the sum of their whispers. But inside, a storm brewed fiercer than the one that had brought her here. Doubt clawing, tearing at the fragile trust she'd begun to place in this weathered man. That night, the house held its breath. Mara sat by the fire, her hands trembling as she mended a tear in Elias's worn coat. Jonas lay asleep, curled like a small warm thing against the blanket. The lamplight flickered shadows across the walls, stretching long fingers into the quiet. "I can't stay here," Mara said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Not like this. Not where I'm a charity case, a story to tell. Elias looked up from his patching, eyes dark and steady. It ain't charity, he said softly. It's bread. Like grace can't be earned, just taken when it's given. Her breath caught. The simplicity of his words struck her like a bell tolling in an empty chapel. Tears gathered and slipped down her cheeks, hot and shameful. She wiped them away quickly, but the warmth lingered. Outside, the wind howled softly, rattling the shutters like a restless spirit. Then came the fire. A candle left too close to the old straw in the barn caught flame before anyone noticed. Smoke curled thick and black, choking the night with sudden fury. Jonas awoke coughing, eyes wide with terror. Mara screamed for Elias, who burst from the house, bare feet pounding through snow and ash. "Buckets! Water!" His voice cracked like a whip in the dark. Mara grabbed a pail, heart hammering as she followed him into the inferno. Sparks bit at her shawl, and she shrieked when a burning ember caught her sleeve. Elias was there in an instant, throwing his heavy coat over her, smothering the flames with desperate force. The barn groaned, timbers snapping like brittle bones. Horses neighed in panic, stamped hooves churning frozen earth. But Elias and Mara fought side by side, their breaths ragged, skins slick with sweat and soot. When the last ember died, dawn was bleeding cold light across the snow. The barn was nothing but charred skeletons, but the family survived. Elias's arm was burned, red and raw beneath the torn sleeve, but he grinned through the pain, exhaustion folding him like a worn blanket. Mara tended the wounds with trembling hands, the flicker of candlelight illuminating the tenderness in her touch. Jonas, wide-eyed and safe, clung to Elias's good arm, finding comfort in the man who had saved them all. "Don't ever say I'm charity," Elias murmured that morning, voice rough but steady. "You're more than that, Mara. You always were." She met his gaze, the ice between them melting away in the soft heat of dawn. Days passed, the scars on Elias's arm healing under Mara's careful watch, their quiet bond deepening like roots beneath the frozen earth. Sheriff Dunbar came by one afternoon, a rare smile breaking through his gruff demeanor. "Town's quieted down," he said, nodding toward the fields. "Guess folks found a new story to chase." Elias shrugged, eyes tracking Jonas as he ran after a stray hen. "Let 'em talk. They don't know the half of it." That evening, Elias set the table with quiet reverence. Only one loaf of bread remained, broken into 3 pieces under the dim candlelight. The flicker of flames danced in Mara's eyes as Elias pushed a piece toward her, one toward Jonas, and kept one for himself. "You once said names don't matter," Mara whispered, voice trembling. He met her gaze, steady as the prairie sky. "Then maybe you take mine." For the boy's sake, she reached out, placing her hand over his. No grand declarations were needed, only the warmth of a touch, the breaking of bread, the silent promise carried in the shared meal. Old Finch's voice returns, slower now, softened with age and memory. "Some say Elias Thorne took in a widow out of pity. I say he found her out of purpose. Scandal, sure, but sometimes salvation wears no grand cloak, just a coat soaked in fire and a heart willing to keep giving." The snow began again, gentle and forgiving, blanketing the world in quiet white. The ranch stood firm, warmed not by the fire alone, but by the unspoken love growing between 2 weary souls who found, in each other, a place to call home. And if ever you find yourself starving, not for bread, but for belonging, remember this: grace often comes wrapped in simple gifts, in quiet gestures and in names we choose to take and keep. This tale is not finished, friend, but for now, let it warm your heart like a fire on a cold night. If this story touched you, subscribe and stay for more Wild West tales, where grit meets grace and every soul finds a second chance.